afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all, especially as the semester is starting to, wind to a close. And obviously that means that there's flowers blooming, but that also means that there's a lot going on in your own heads, trying to retain a lot of information, for quick demonstration sometime soon. I wanted to just say a couple quick words while our terrific panelists get settled. This is another of the events that we are holding in what is really a series of events to consider the rapid changes in our political and legal environment that have been in front of us since January. And I just want to remind us all of the effort that the law school is going through to help us all contextualize and understand and place what's happening in our classrooms, what we're learning in our classrooms, into the realities of the day-to-day lives that we are, living and seeing roll out in front of us. So the first of those was on executive orders. The second was on immigration. Last week we held an event on how government built America. Today we'll hear about legal attacks on the media. We're still working on an event that we're hoping we will be able to pull together in combination with the Hamilton Lugar School on the iterations with international law and obviously international trade issues and other international legal issues. And then in addition to those events that we've been holding in person, which have been really terrifically attended and well received, I want to remind you all that as a Big Ten law school, we are participating with other Big Ten law schools to put together 10 webinars on the rule of law in 2025. And the third of those events will happen this Wednesday, and we are the hosts for the event this Wednesday, so please watch your emails for the details on that. This Wednesday's event will be on rearticulations of sex and gender, and the schedule for the rest of them is also really compelling, and it's a great series that is pulling on experts from the entire Big Ten, which essentially these days means the entire country, and but it really is a terrific group of experts. So please plug in to as many of those as you can, even when they feel like they're slightly to the side of your specific interests in law, because there's so much change and we are so committed to teaching you the doctrine in our classes that in order to apply that doctrine to the realities of our daily lives right now, that series is a terrific educational opportunity. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve Sanders, who will introduce this particular panel. Thank you so much, everyone.
So, thank you for coming. Carl Bernstein returns to Mauer and to Bear Hall with this panel. I was privileged to be able to have a conversation that was wide-ranging last semester. Today, we have, as Dean Ochoa suggested, we wanted to integrate a panel discussion into our programming about the changes that are going on since January. And this one is devoted specifically to legal and political attacks on the media, that environment, both in a historical perspective and in a contemporary perspective. We have Carl Bernstein, legendary journalist, famous, of course, from the Watergate era with his reporting partner Bob Woodward in revealing the extent of the crimes and the aftermath of the Watergate break-in, something that ultimately led to the downfall of the president. And he has remained an active journalist, best-selling author, commentator. Is spending periods here at Indiana University this year, under the auspices of the Media School and the Culture Center. And my colleague Joe Tomaine, who teaches, among other things, media law, has a strong interest in the law related to the press specifically. And so with these two partners, we want to talk a little bit about the historical and contemporary context of legal and political attacks on the media. Carl, I think no one better than you could give the opening case for why a vigorous news media are important to the health of a democracy. Would you say something about that, about why? We may not think about it. The media environment changes and continues to evolve, what we consider media to be, but why is a healthy, free, independent media critical to a democracy?
Well, it's particularly critical because we have the First Amendment, which gives us this extraordinary ability to make a commitment and fulfill a commitment to what Woodward and myself have called for half a century now the best obtainable version of the truth. And that's really what our responsibility is. And it's a tremendous responsibility. It's a grave responsibility in a democracy, and particularly given the latitude that we have under the First Amendment. And many more articulate people than myself, including presidents of the United States, have said that really what makes us different and what is the last bastion of democracy and is our free press. And so it distinguishes us in terms of a mission. And you look at what has happened around the world, the trends have, the last 20 years have been anti-democratic around the world. There have been 20, 30, I can't give the exact number of countries that have moved from being democracies to become authoritarian states. And of those, only one that I believe, did it through a coup. It was all done through democratic elections. It was chosen by the people of these countries to move toward autocracy, and indeed those countries have become anti-democratic autocracies. And now we have perhaps something similar going on here. So the answer, I think, to your question is a pretty obvious one. That we are the last bastion, and we're also, particularly in this presidency, the first opportunity that the President of the United States sees to attack. Same was true in Watergate. That Nixon, from the very beginning of our reporting at the Washington Post, tried to make the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate, not the conduct of the president and those around him. And it succeeded for a very long time. Even our colleagues in the press in Washington, for a few months, really didn't believe what we were reporting, and were very, very, very skeptical. So I think Trump has taken this to a new level. I should also add that President Obama opened up some floodgates himself in national security cases by compelling the Justice Department to go ahead with prosecutions that required bringing in reporters to reveal their sources or face jail. So, yeah, we're an easy mark, and yet, if we don't do our job, I think everything is in peril, especially now.
That's what I'm hoping you can say a little more on. What interest does the public at large have in this independence and freedom of the media? We have a First Amendment, as you said, but there must be some reason that the framers thought it was important to protect the freedom of the press. What do we all lose if the press are not as independent and free to do their jobs?
Well, I think you have to divide your question into two parts. I think we have to do it whatever the results are going to be. And it doesn't mean that if we do our job, the results are going to be what we want. But we have to make the effort. I think we ought to talk a little bit about the people of the country. The Trump presidency, Make America Great Again. Look, half half the country of voting age appears to have embraced with great enthusiasm what Trump has said he wants to do and believes in. Now, maybe some of what we're seeing now might tamper some of that enthusiasm. We'll see. But looking at the objective as being a certain result that we want, whether in the press or as citizens, seems to me to be not terribly productive. That we need to do it regardless of whether the result is the desired result is there, and the odds of the desired result coming about may not be very likely. That we live in a culture now where the best obtainable version of the truth, to go back to that phrase, is not highly valued necessarily by the same percentage of citizens as it was 50 years ago. And I'm sure that that's the case. I can't give you a metric on it, but increasingly what has happened over the course of half a century since then, people in this country increasingly are looking for information. This is by no means limited to one ideology or party or the other. People are looking for information to reinforce what they already believe. Religious, political, social beliefs, not the best obtainable version of the truth. So that we now have a culture that is very different than at the time of Watergate. And it's very different in that regard, I believe. So that makes our job even harder. Because without that, look, until the discovery of Nixon's tapes and the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, I'm talking to a group of law students, so I'm going to presume something is known by the people here about the events that I'm describing. Until the Saturday Night Massacre, most people in the country supported Nixon and continued to. And it wasn't until the disclosure of what was on those tapes that public opinion really swung toward this man should not be the President of the United States. And again, in Watergate, the heroes in many regards were Republicans who were members of the Senate Watergate Committee, some of them, then the House Judiciary Committee, which voted articles of impeachment with crucial votes being cast for the articles by Republicans, and then a delegation of Republicans led by Barry Goldwater, the great conservative nominee of his party in 1964 for President of the United States, went to the White House to meet with Nixon, the Republican leadership. And Nixon knew that he was going to be impeached by the full House. That was a foregone conclusion. And the question was, would he be acquitted by the Senate or convicted? Just as the question of would Trump be acquitted by the Senate or convicted twice came about. And Goldwater and his fellow leaders sat across from Nixon in the Oval Office, and Nixon said, "Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate?" Fully expecting that Goldwater would tell him that he had a pretty good chance of being acquitted. And Goldwater looked at Nixon and said, "Well, Mr. President, right now you may have 4 or 5 votes for acquittal, and I'm not one of them." And that was it. The next day, Nixon announced that he would resign. So we have a very different environment than we're in. And look what happened on January the 7th when McConnell and McCarthy got up and said, the President of the United States has to be held responsible for what happened at the Capitol yesterday. And by January the 9th, they had both backtracked. So we You don't have the accountability. And at the same time, I just come back to this notion that even though the outcome might not be the desired one, we need to know that we have done our job and the information is out there for people, for history, and for giving democracy a chance as the last bastion.
Before I turn to Professor Tolene to talk about some current active examples of the press media being under legal threats right now. Legal threats were something you faced, something the Post, something Bob Woodward faced at the time. I think, and pardon my language here, you were told by, I believe it was President Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, that if Katharine Graham allowed you to continue doing your reporting on Watergate, she would, quote, get her tit caught in a ringer. Just to put it in perspective, in what ways did the Nixon administration, the government, attempt to hobble your ability to do your work in the 1970s?
Well, we go to question two ways. First of all, the Nixon White House decided that it would attack the financial wherewithal of the Washington Post Company, which had as its major source of income its television stations. And the renewal of the FCC licenses for those stations was coming up. And so the same former Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, formulated this notion with others in the White House that they would try to deny the Post those licenses and starve it of its profit. And this is just when the Post had gone public. And so they attempted that, and the FCC did not take away the licenses of the Post. But going back to the very beginning, as I say, the object of the White House was to make our conduct the issue. And so on the occasion that you refer to, we wrote a story that said that this same John Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States, and he was Nixon's former law partner, had controlled a secret fund that paid for the bugging at Watergate and other undercover activities against the Nixon White House's opponents. And so as usual, when we wrote the story, I called the White House to get a comment from the press secretary and reached him and read him the story, and he said, I'll get back to you on that. And he called back and he said, here's our response. And he said, the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. I typed it out. And I said, yes. He said, that's it. I said, well, aside from this geyser that's going off in our backyard, is the story true? Did Mr. Mitchell control those funds? And did such a fund exist? And he repeated, the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. And very frustrating, and we were used to it. We came to call that the non-denial denial. And I had a number for Mitchell in New York. I called him, and he answered the phone, and I told him we were running this story the next day, and could I read it to him? And as I read him the first few words of the story, he said, Jesus. I read a few more words into the first paragraph, which time the story, the drift of it was unmistakable, and he said, Jesus. And then he said, Jesus Christ, if you print that, all that crap, if you put that in the paper, Katie Graham, referring to the publisher of the Post, is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer. But then there was a pause after that. And he said, and when this campaign is over, we're going to do a little story on you two boys, and he hung up the phone. I can tell you it's the most chilling moment I've ever experienced in the 60-something years that I've been in journalism. And I called Ben Bradley at home, the editor of the Washington Post, and told him what Mitchell had said. And Bradley said, "He really said that about Mrs. Graham?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, put it all in the paper, but leave her tit out." Next morning, Mrs. Graham came down to my desk and said, "Carl, do you have any more messages for me?" And but back to your question about what their strategy was, and a little bit later, I got a call from the guard at the entrance to the Post saying there was a subpoena server there with a subpoena for our notes. And I said, "Well, don't let him upstairs." And I called Bradley again and told him. And Bradley said, "Let me go talk to Catherine Graham." Came back to me about 10 minutes later, and he said, "Mrs. Graham says they're not your notes. They're her notes. And if anyone is going to go to jail, she's going to go to jail." It says, I'm still get goosebumps from that moment. So, but it really goes to the heart of the question. Do we have institutions and individuals who are willing to do that? And the answer is yes, we do. And so what is it that we're up against now? We're up against, as a people, as a democracy, about a president of the United States in the 50th anniversary edition of All the President's Men. Woodward and I wrote a new foreword, and comparing Trump and Nixon. And we say in there that he's the first seditionist president of the United States. And really, that's what the January 6th case went to. The January 6th case is a great legal case. I say this as someone who covered the courts for a long time, that the investigation by the House committee, the Cheney so-called committee, is one of the great investigations. It's as great an investigation as really the Watergate investigation by the Senate Watergate Committee was, and done in a very compressed time. And here you have both circumstantial evidence in what the special prosecutor developed partly as a result of that investigation, huge mountains of circumstantial evidence, as well as testimony from the Vice President of the United States, from the counsel to the President of the United States. And what the Supreme Court did in the immunity decision, as horrible as the immunity decision is, and crazy in terms of, I mean, think of Nixon. If that decision existed at the time of Watergate, Nixon would have burned the tapes. Could have burned the tapes. Said, "Oh yeah, the contents of that tapes they're all about my official duties. I'm immune from anybody hearing them." I mean, you could take, and so what we have with Trump is a president. Well, when we go back to that decision, and I can be long-winded, as my wife reminds me, but not only did they do the immunity decision, they didn't take the case in a timely manner. I'm not privy to the discussions among the justices, but it would seem to me that there is a political calculation of some sort, not necessarily but by political meaning, well, how it will affect the election, which it obviously would, but there was plenty of time for them to say, let the case go ahead, as the lower courts had said. And had we had that trial, then history might be much different. So we now have a president of the United States who is breaking new ground every day. I don't have to tell you all this. in terms of, and one other thing that's relevant here is that the powers of the president have increased exponentially since Ford with every president. The power, partly by the abdication of responsibility by the Congress of the United States, partly by Supreme Court decisions, but by and large, the president has just asserted it. Presidents, plural, have just asserted these powers. Now, Trump has taken these assertions and taken them somewhere that none of us, I believe, could have imagined, and he's doing it with great effectiveness. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says in one case after another, but we're in a paroxysm of the seizure of democracy through these instruments and through the enabling of the Supreme Court.
I want to turn to Joe to talk about, with that historical context, what are a few examples of specific legal threats being brought against the media that the media face today? And then after Joe gives us some thoughts on that, we'll see if Carl has any reactions and for questions and discussion. But tell us what's going on right now today as we speak in this area.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'll certainly remember this day. It's great to sit up here. My focus is on the nonpartisan nature of free speech because it is a necessary, albeit insufficient, condition for our American democracy. And I'll provide 4 current legal attacks that demonstrate this nonpartisan nature. So the first one, the use of consumer protection laws. And I'm going to briefly talk about 3 cases, but they're specifically the use of consumer protection laws against the media. So the first case is called Washlight versus Fox News. It's a Washington State Appellate Court decision from 2021. There was a legal ethics and transparency nonprofit in Washington State. They brought a lawsuit against Fox News for the Consumer Protection Act in Washington State for misleading information about COVID vaccines and COVID itself. They lost that case, as they should, and I'll give some reasons why in a second. The second case is Trump versus Seltzer. And this is in Iowa against a pollster named Ann Seltzer. In October, she had issued a poll in the Des Moines Register saying that Kamala Harris was up by 3 points. That obviously turned out to be inaccurate. And Trump sued Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register under Iowa's Consumer Fraud Act. And then the third case is Trump versus 60 Minutes, which might be the one that's most in common knowledge. And this is where there was an interview with Kamala Harris in October, and Trump filed a lawsuit in Texas saying that the interview was cut in a misleading way. That's under Texas's Deceptive Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Act. The 2 major points here are that the First Amendment just simply bars these claims as a matter of course. There is only a handful of categories of unprotected speech, and assuming that all of these are false, they're still protected by the First Amendment under a case involving the Stolen Valor Act. So even if these are all false speech, the First Amendment bar these claims, particularly because they involve matters of public concern. The second part is, even if the First Amendment does not bar these claims, I think any decent law student who was to look at a Consumer Fraud Act would realize these claims simply don't apply against news publications. And in fact, that's what the Washington Light versus Fox News case held. It says that a news article is not a product or service in trade or commerce. These acts simply don't apply. Taken together, you can see Fox News on the one hand and the Trump cases against 60 Minutes and Seltzer help to start demonstrate the nonpartisan nature here, but it goes even further. The organization representing Ann Seltzer in the Iowa case is called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. They've obviously expanded beyond that. I have their motion to dismiss. I'm happy to share it, but just a few highlights there. One example that they show, there was a plaintiff in Illinois that used Illinois' Consumer Fraud Act to sue an anti-abortion advocacy organization for publishing information. That case was dismissed by the Northern District of Illinois in 2023, and the court wrote, quote, that this case was both stupid and very likely unconstitutional. There was also a lawsuit against the Weather Channel for an inaccurate forecast, like a poll. The Weather Channel won. And then also in the motion to dismiss, they point out that in Trump's Iowa suit that he uses the fraud so many times in the complaint, and then they quote everybody's favorite movie, The Princess Bride. You keep saying that word, but I don't think you know what it means. So that's one example. Number two, sticking with 60 Minutes, the FCC is also investigating 60 Minutes. And there are traditional conservative organizations that have sent a letter to the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, urging him to drop the 60 Minutes investigation, calling it, quote, regulatory overreach. These conservative organizations include the Center for Individual Freedom, Americans for Tax Reform, and the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Third, the Associated Press ban. This is where the Associated Press has refused to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. However, they did change their style guide to say, however, the President of the United States calls it the Gulf of America. Newsmax has issued a statement that says, quote, we can understand President Trump's frustration because the media has often been unfair to him, but Newsmax still supports the AP's right as a private organization to use the language that it wants in reporting, and we fear that future administrations might do something similar, and so therefore Newsmax, and I think Fox News, has also stood beside the Associated Press. Additionally, in that Associated Press case, there is an amici brief, including, quote, a group of conservative or independent former government officials, including those who were elected as Republicans or served in Republican administrations. And again, they say, when powerful government officials exclude the press from access to information, as the White House has done with the Associated Press, they violate one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy. The fourth and final point here, and then I'll just briefly conclude, a shield law. So, a shield law allows a journalist to protect the identity of their confidential source. Some shield laws go even further. There is no federal shield law. And there are lots of states that have shield laws, including Indiana, which in one sense is very strong because it provides absolute protection for the identification of a source. You never have to disclose that in Indiana state courts. Surprisingly, in 2024, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed a federal shield bill. However, the president wrote at the time in all caps, so everybody could hear him clearly, on his social media platform, Republicans must kill this bill, and I don't think we'll see it go anywhere else. By the way, in 2005, then Congressman Mike Pence was one of the strongest advocates for a federal shield law. And he said in 2005, I really believe the only check on government power is a free and independent press. This is an opportunity to pound some rivets around the First Amendment. So taken together, you can see that there is nonpartisan support for free speech, and it's necessary for us to find that common ground, even though we might ultimately disagree on the ultimate policies or where the truth may lead. And so finally, and I will kind of maybe swing this back to Carl, James Goodale used to be the general counsel for the New York Times. He represented them during the Pentagon Papers case. And he wrote an article last year quoting a federal judge from 1975. And the title of the article is Fight Like Tigers. And what James Goodale said is, and I'm curious if you were there, you might not remember, which I probably wouldn't either, but in 1975, James Goodale at the Waldorf Astoria organized a conference for press lawyers. And at that conference, the Second Circuit Judge Harold Medina said, encourage the press to fight like tigers. And James Goodale questioned whether or not the press is going to fight like tigers today. And one of the things that he said last year is that he emphasized that it was fight like tigers, not tiger. It's plural. It requires the press to come together. And I hope that through these examples, and I'm happy to talk more, but you can see that there is clear opportunity to come together for free speech, for the purpose of democracy, regardless of whatever political ideology one might have.
I want to ask Carl if he has any reactions, but just one quick follow-up, Joe. Earlier you were saying, even if the stuff was false, it doesn't matter. It's still protected. What is the theory behind that idea? Why should something still get First Amendment protection even if it's false?
This really just goes back to New York Times versus Sullivan and the establishment of the actual malice standard, is that no matter which rule we choose, something is going to happen. So if we were too restrictive on speech, that will chill individuals from speaking out loud, and therefore we might hurt the disclosure of truth. On the other hand, if we have a very permissive status for protection of speech, including false speech, that means that errors are going to be made, as long as they are not done intentionally, that we would rather live with those errors than have truthful speech be self-censored.
And just to be clear, the untruth, but as long as it was sort of good faith untruth, that applies to public figures, libel law still protects individuals against having untrue things.
Indiana does even one better. In Indiana, if you are speaking on a matter of public concern, even if you are a private figure, you still have to prove the actual malice standard. There was a case out of Notre Dame this year. There's a conservative student publication called The Irish Rover. There is a professor at Notre Dame, not at the law school, who was advocating for protecting abortion rights and maybe said certain things about how she would help students. The Irish Rover made some statements about this professor, and she sued the Irish Rover. Ultimately, the Indiana Appellate Court in January dismissed that claim, affirmed the dismissal, because the Irish Rover, even if they were inaccurate in what they said, they did not do so intentionally or with reckless disregard to the truth. I think that's a great thing. Because now we don't have to figure out, except on law school exams, who's a public figure, who's a private figure. As long as we can identify that the matter is one of public concern, Indiana goes even further than the First Amendment requires.
Carl, you have the reporter's notebook out, so only read what you
Well, I just started making some notes, and the word I wrote twice is intimidation. I think we need to also look at the larger presidential environment in which this is happening. And that is that Donald Trump, long ago, both in regard to the press and business in general, figured out, partly at the knee of Roy Cohn, his mentor, that intimidation is the way around legal constraint, including the First Amendment. And we're seeing that now. We see it in some of the cases that you've cited. But it's a basic strategy, because he understands the point of vulnerability, both in terms of journalistic institutions and in terms of other institutions and individuals who obviously have to think twice about fiduciary responsibilities, about their personal well-being. It's one thing to talk about these principles that we seek to uphold and we see are not being upheld by newspaper owners of recent note that have capitulated, of law firms that have capitulated. So I think we need to look at the larger environment and look what Trump is doing with, quote, Russia. He's going after people who pursued either the law, the truth, and take his suit against Bob Woodward. Happily, Bob has I think you all know what the case is. Trump has claimed that the interviews that he did with Bob and that Bob published, both separately and in his book, as a collection of interviews, that Trump has claimed that those words are his, and that he has possession of them, and that Woodward has suing Woodward for, I can't even remember the amount, $50 million, and Simon & Schuster, the publisher. Happily, Simon & Schuster is defending this. But all of this comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to Simon & Schuster, but look at what this larger environment, the basic strategy now is to escape the First Amendment through intimidation. And it's a very difficult, you might say, well, it's easy for a newspaper or for a reporter to be a tiger. Maybe yes, maybe no. It requires extraordinary courage, willingness to, you have to worry about your family. And let me say, we are also moving toward an environment that on all sides in which personal safety is becoming an issue. So all of this is happening in a context of becoming this authoritarian state, or assertions of it, in which the old protections that we thought we had under the First Amendment, that law firms would take on any client, we're losing through this intimidation, this and you go down the line, exactly. So our culture is being turned upside down, even as Trump seeks to use the legal system. On top of which, since he started in business, what was his basic strategy? Don't pay anybody, sue them. Settle for 10 cents on the dollar. So we're dealing with an individual in the presidency. In this introduction that I mentioned to the 50th anniversary edition of All the President's Men, it begins by quoting George Washington in his farewell address, in which he basically says that there's one, and I'm not giving his exact words, but what he's saying in this passage in the farewell address is that really the one thing that we and our system can't handle, that we're ill-equipped to deal with, is if powerful men, which is a phrase he uses, seek to pursue their own interests above those of the nation. And so the history of the presidency is, yes, we've had, and it's an amazing warning by our first president. And we've had presidents in the past. Nixon was a criminal president. You can certainly look at actions of other presidents that have been contrary to the national interest, and because a president has asserted personal concerns, but never, ever the President of the United States who is doing what Washington talked about as the most basic aspect of governance.
We have time for a few questions. And I see lots of questions. So, yeah, here.
Thank you for being here, Mr. President. It means a lot to all of us. My question is in regards to something you mentioned last time. Maintaining some civil relations with the president, no matter what's going on in order to get information. I remember last time you talked a little bit about journalists going to Mar-a-Lago, talking to the president, and what you just spoke about with Mr. Woodward. I've listened to a couple of his interviews, and it's interesting to see as he doesn't really have to say much. Trump almost has a line employee, just goes and goes and goes. And at the end of the day, he's obviously being sued for this. And what I'm curious is, you say that things are dangerous right now for reporters. How do you go about, how do you toe the line right now in terms of giving
Well, first of all, I think, can everybody hear the question? First of all, I think you got to make an exception about Fox News. Fox News is not a news organization. It wasn't conceived as a real news operation. It was conceived to do what it does. It also is probably the most powerful political instrument and most important in this country in the last 50 years. And I don't think there's much question about that. It's changed our culture. It's changed news, even while Fox News is not news. And I think that we just go on doing what we do. And that's the only answer. And part of being a reporter is try to strategize how you deal with people who see you as an enemy. Look, our sources in Watergate all were Republicans, really no Democratic sources to speak of. All Republicans, and most of whom worked for Richard Nixon. That to do what we do, we need to be talking with those people. We're going to learn things, no matter how antagonistic they are toward us. They're going to be, hopefully, our sources of information, as they were during Watergate. Some of them might turn out to be quite principled people in ways that we did not anticipate. So I think that, but it's an environment in which the enmity and not just, again, Nixon came after us, he came after the Washington Post. What we're seeing now is a brush so much broader as a basic strategy. And to not only discredit the press, but to force it to capitulate. And as well as capitulation across the board, not just the press. This is the basic strategy. And then he'll see what he's able to get in the Supreme Court and what he's not able to get. But meanwhile, he's won. He's won on campus. And God help us if it ends up he's winning on the press. And we see some very troublesome examples where ownership would seem to have capitulated out of fear.
All the President's Men was such a wonderful movie that it would have been more wonderful if that line from Mrs. Graham was in it. They're my notes, not your notes. That's such a wonderful story that I have not heard.
It's funny, I was asked a question about, was there anything that you regret is not in an earlier class about All the President's Men, the movie. And that's the one thing I do regret. Mrs. Graham did not want to be played by an actor. She did not want her to be portrayed. And that is the one regret I probably have.
Dan, we'll try to see if we can get to one or two more.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you hold the same sentiment against the intimidation towards like the Biden administration's pressuring of social media platforms to censor and remove would it be COVID misinformation or something which turned out to be non-misinformation, or do you view that as a different thing altogether?
I'm not familiar enough with the pieces of information themselves to know whether the Biden people genuinely believed.
One very good example would be the lab.
The what?
The lab leak.
Right. Right, but the question I'm raising is, and not to defend the Biden presidency, I'll get to that in a minute, because there was a terrible cover-up by President Biden and those around him as he sought a second term about his mental and physical condition. And really grievous. And so I don't know the facts of whether or not the Biden people in this instance believed the market story or versus the lab story. I just don't know enough. So I don't know if to answer your question.
I guess my question is whether they believe it or not doesn't matter when it's been shown that they did intimidate social media.
And I hear you saying it may hinge on, like, if they did it in good
No,
faith.
look, I don't think, I'd have to know, I obviously don't know enough about this, is my answer, and because I don't know enough about what form the alleged intimidation took. And look, I don't think that extra legal or intimidation is something that ought to be condoned under any circumstances. Would be my, no matter who the hell does it.
Yeah, Christian.
Yeah, so this is more towards so in those cases that you mentioned, this lack of interpretation classified these as like lawfare, so that's like the first question. And the second question is, New York Times has a unanimous decision but different opinions from different houses. What would it take for also with this actually case if New York Times was altered in some way or reversed, would that actually affect these types of cases that we're about now? And what would it actually take for the Supreme Court to sort of make that decision to avoid Montana?
It would take 5 justices. Currently, there are
Legal realism answer.
currently there are 2. As far as lawfare, I think that's a fair characterization. The use of the Consumer Fraud Protection Act lawsuits, I think, is an example of a misuse of consumer fraud statutes. As far as whether we should modify the actual malice standard, I think, on our last minute here, I'll stop early, but there's a nice book by, I think it's David Enrich, that came out called Murder the Truth, that's about the actual malice standard, and I would suggest that if you're interested in that topic.
Maybe time for one more question? Yeah, in the back. Allison.
Economic realities have affected the media landscape. So I'm thinking about like calls like defund PBS. You also have things like reporting by like legacy outlets that are behind paywalls versus you can get like this information for free from Facebook and things like that.
I think that the media landscape is pocked with holes that are the result of what's happened over the past 50 years in terms of decimating institutions. I don't think there's any question about it. But I also have to say, the loss of local news is a communal loss in this country that's incalculable and irreplaceable. And at the same time, we're starting to see some nonprofits based on, say, the Texas Tribune model. Texas Tribune, really the best reporting organization in Texas, and regarded so by people in the press and by a lot of people it covers. And that model is starting to be exported to other states. So you have that. You also have, though, so much great reporting, particularly investigative reporting, going on in the United States, a lot of it by nonprofits, a lot of it by the few legacy organizations that are still there. And then you look around the world at the most courageous investigative reporting you can imagine in places like Russia, and where people's lives are at stake. I'm not pessimistic about the reporting. I'm pessimistic about the larger culture that doesn't value it, and also whether or not we are now so vulnerable to what George Washington was talking about. And that what we're seeing is, I mean, in these 80 days, whatever it is so extraordinary. And the danger so obvious, and its effectiveness even thus far, and the both nefarious and vengeful aspects, and the hate being the piston that drives so much of it, is a somewhat, I mean, the Nixon example is one thing, but we've moved on to territory that we've never been in.
So those of you who've had Professor Tremaine know that you are learning things and hearing things you will remember for years to come and tell your children and grandchildren about. And I think being able to hear Carl Bernstein today is similarly something you will remember and know that you were in the presence of somebody who has witnessed and made so much history for the past 50 years. So please join me in thanking both of you.